Hi, Craig. Welcome back to Rendering Unconscious. I was looking back through, and you were actually episode 12 of Rendering Unconscious, and now you're going to be, I think, 329.
Wow, you've been busy.
Yeah, and we have
Um,
to make sure we don't miss that much time again.
yeah, definitely, definitely. Um, yeah, I can only imagine what it's like to have done, 300 of these now. I'm sure you have your grooves and your patterns and all kinds of things.
It's been a
Um,
ride. I didn't really have an idea of what I was doing when I started. It just came to me. I should
mm,
start a podcast. I know so many interesting people. I can start
mm,
interviewing them. And yeah, it's just continued on for now. It'll be 7 years next week. So
wow,
yeah.
wow. Yeah, yeah, pandemic time is a thing, isn't it? Wow. Um, Yeah, it's interesting you say, didn't know what you were doing because like I often find it's one of those, you know, interesting ideas that if we don't know what we're doing, we can mess up horribly, but at the same time, we're not having massive expectations of how it should go. And, there is something very magical about the whole, oh, well, the shape that forms is from the environment we end up in. So if you don't know what you're doing, often the shape is a kind of an emergent process, I guess.
This is how I like to live life. I don't like to think too much or plan too far ahead of like the idea of how I want it to be because I don't think that works out. Then you're
Mm,
just going to be disappointed because life is not going to be what you expect it to be. So
yeah.
instead, what I did when I started the podcast, I go by like whatever gets me excited. And I just remember I was like in Florida. I was in between moving from New York to Sweden, and I had a little bit of time where my residency permit wasn't ready yet, but I'd already kind of closed and left everything in New York. So I was is spending a time in my hometown in Miami in Florida. And then I remember sitting there and I just like had the idea, like got this like excited feeling in my body, like, ooh, I should start a podcast and start interviewing people because I
Mm,
was already like doing a bunch of events in New York when I was there and like hosting different events. So it kind of like continued in that spirit, but online. And it's really worked out and I love it. So always go with these things that get you excited, whether or not it rationally makes sense. That's my advice.
mm, mm. And I think one of the interesting things is that, on so many levels, we have this idea of, this doesn't make any rational sense, but I'm going to go with it versus, if it makes rational sense, I have to plan it all out and do this and do that. And, you know, I keep thinking back to this weird idea that we as so-called moderns have of rationality. And I'm like, you go back to pre-Socratic stuff, and we're literally talking about the rational as that which the daimonic says to us. You know, pre, even Socrates with his daimon, but you're literally talking about rationality as a completely different concept to how it's, you know, come to us now and been moved by our society, and all the people who go, "Oh yeah, be rational," or even Burroughs with "Destroy All Rational Thought," is still like dealing with this idea of rationality as this, this constructed thing rather than this, relationship with this these dynamic forces, and I find that really interesting because we're in such a mess at the moment with people, coming back to ideas of fascism, and then they're, talking about rationality and it's rational to do this and rational to do that, and arguments over what's rational and what's irrational on all sides. And I find it really interesting that, you know, the definitions were different and have been different, and that's not really generally considered. It's not considered that rationality, as we have it now, is not as it's always been. Um, so yeah, I really, myself feel that doing the things that embrace whatever form of life moves you is probably, you know, the best way to live your life well, even if you're in a situation where you have limited resources. Sometimes, from a disability perspective, you're sat there going, well, I could spend all this energy on all these sensible, rational things, but they'd exhaust me anyway. So I might as well spend the energy on this completely, seemingly irrational thing that's actually going to, illuminate my life and enrich it. And that's a really subtle difference, I think, from the, you know, oh, I'm going to gratify myself. And I think a lot of people don't make that distinction, which is really interesting to me.
Totally. And it's kind of the opposite of what society tells us to do. They're like, always choose the rational over the thing that might you might enjoy or might, yeah, give you pleasure or help illuminate your
Mm.
life, because illumination is kind of seen as something, as a waste of time.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. God forbid you want to recontextualize your life, and have a moment where you're like, actually, I don't want to do this anymore, whatever this is.
Hmm.
You know, there really does feel like there's an investment in our society of like, you know, once you're in, and you can't back off, whether that's sunk cost fallacy or anything else. Like, I think it's tied up with identity as well. Like, once I am this, I can't change. Once I am firm in this identity, firm in this sense of myself, it's dangerous to let that crystallized sense of self fall away. Or so, society tells us, but there is something deeply liberatory about realizing that all these particular individual selves and identities are literally just stepping stones as you're making a journey through a river, in terms of a metaphor, I guess. And eventually they're going to submerge back into the water, and that's okay, because what matters is that the river is running and you're participating in the running river. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know the psychology of that, but from a magical perspective, I think, a lot of Austin Spares stuff is very much, you know, a lot more fluid than, say, Crowley's sense of identities. But I could be wrong on that. That's just for me looking at the pair of them and comparing them and going, oh, you know, um, there's a fluidity there that I don't think makes a lot of sense to a lot of people these days, unless you're into magic or strange things like that, because everything is so desperately people trying to locate themselves. And one of the biggest things that I've, you know, internalized over the past sort of 5 years is that actually, to borrow from my friend Bayo Akamalafe, one of the best things you can do is indulge in getting lost. Um, and when you're lost, that's when things get interesting.
I love that. What do you like to get lost in?
You know, it's really difficult to say there's a particular thing, but I think I would get lost more often in wondering why we don't pay attention to our sense of embodiment. What is it about that makes us so resistant to considering our sense of embodiment, and how does that relate to everything, all the stories we tell about, health, wellness, things like that? Because I get lost in this thicket of knowing that my entire body is composed of all these different systems that are interrelating with the inside and the outside, and that there are so many participants in my experience, in my the experience that I have that is supposedly mine. There are so many agencies and entities and histories all involved, and I love to get lost in kind of the garden of forked paths that comes up from that, because I'm like, I'm not entirely sure that this is mine per se, and getting lost in that idea that actually, you know what, um, some of the things that I'm saying may not actually be me, not in a channeling sense, but in a some of the things might be bits of the landscape that are actually reaching into me at that point. And it really, it plays interestingly, particularly over the pandemic, with the way that people have kind of become really, well, avoidant about the implications of having, uh, you know, disease as agencies. The way we've kind of gone, oh, we've got to get back to absolute normal, when we had that period during peak pandemic where, in a sense, people were thinking, oh, is another world possible?
Hmm.
Is another way of things doing things possible? And then almost immediately, sort of when things eased a little bit and we got the vaccine, the majority were like, nope, nope, we want to go back to exactly what was there before. And I think that's really interesting. That instinct to abandon this potential new world in favor of what we know. It just, you know,
Yeah, that brought us to that point in the first place.
exactly. Yeah, yeah. Um, so I'm really leaning into the idea of, you know, getting lost and being confused, because one of the biggest things I think is viable is I don't know what's going on. I don't know what's going on in my own body, but it's fun to find out. I don't know what's going on in the vast, complex network of agencies and forces in a magical living animist universe. I can't know them all. It's not possible. I'm not in total control. I can just, anybody in a so-called animist universe is always at the mercy of myriad other forces, not in the sense of, necessarily being oppressed or attacked, but it's just, if everything is relational, then there's a whole bunch of stuff that is affecting us that we are not directly involved in. There's a whole bunch of things where histories and entities and you know emotions, in a matter of fact, from a whole bunch of things, influence our daily life in ways we don't even know. So part of the trick for me is trying to trace those relations that I can and work with them without trying to overexert on them, which is the essence of the things that I wrote about in, Rendering Unconscious and the Fenris Wolf, was this notion of how do you exist when you have the limited, uh, you know, Cripkult idea? How do you exist when you are sick? When you don't have this idea of the prime ability and prime energy, how do you, in some way, I guess the phrase I've been using lately comes back in a loop, is how do you exist with generative incapacities? Um, and I think for me at least, the notion that, a lot of openings and possibilities can happen when we acknowledge actually we're not, masters of the universe. We're not in control. And yeah, maybe magic is about uh, working with those forces to make things a little easier for ourselves, for the things we care about. But we're not in control. We're not the center of the universe. Um, so how do we live like that when our entire society is based upon the idea, hey, you should want to be the center of the universe? Um, I don't have answers for that really, but I do think it's interesting to entertain.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought up that moment in COVID too, because I think about it all the time. It seemed like such an opportunity where, it showed that like if we did all like have something that we needed to do, we could actually like stop things, like stop the traffic, stop all the, everything and just like stop in a dime and like shift gears and do things differently. And it was like, seems to me like the universe presented us with an opportunity to do that before we face greater catastrophes.
Mm,
But
mm,
yeah, like you said, everyone, not everyone, the majority, including the corporations and governments, was like, no, 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 let's go back to normal and like
mm,
keep the economy going. It's important. And they really like rushed people back into traveling and rushed people back into the kind of business as usual. And it's so disappointing, so
mm.
kind of heartbreaking to
And
watch.
I think I mean, there is a certain point where humans don't like to acknowledge, or don't talk about some of the really grim stuff. But the fact of the matter is, you know, without wishing to get too dark, millions of people across the world died and are, still dying,
Hmm.
albeit to a lesser extent. And we haven't from a psychological and even from a magical perspective, we haven't engaged with grief in a way that I think is absolutely necessary, and plenty of cultures that are not ours make the point that grief is dealing with grief, however you deal with grief, is important
Hmm.
in a living universe, and how you relate to death and what happens to your kin and the people you care about when that happens. We haven't had that, and I think on some level, that reckoning, the universe has kind of gone, okay, you ignored that one. Don't worry, you're going to have that reckoning eventually.
Hmm.
With climate change, there's no escape. You're going to be grieving humanity, you know, no matter how much you protest and stomp your feet like a small child who doesn't want to, do a thing. There's no way out of that. So if we could develop a way of processing that large scale soul grief, maybe things would be a little more, you know, a little more clear for a lot of people. But I feel like, for a huge chunk of people, they're so lost, but they're not comfortable in being lost, so they're grabbing onto, um, you know, maps, or they're grabbing onto things that they recognize, which is part of why they're willing to accept, that pushed back to normal, because normal was a map they kind of understood, even if they didn't like it.
Hmm.
Um, and in fact, even if they knew it was hurting them and killing them in the long term, that was better for them than the whole sense of, oh God, what do we do?
Mm. Yeah, at
You
least it
know,
was familiar. Hmm.
yeah, yeah.
It's a really good point. And people do that like as individuals too. In psychoanalysis, it's like when you're trying to kind of break down those like ego structures of what you've been identified with, like if it's not serving you, these patterns that you've created over your lifetime, like usually in childhood when you were dealing with your family environment. When you get older, you're in a different environment, you're creating your own structure, home. does it serve you well? You're trying to break those down so you can kind of move forward in a better way or a more fluid way. But there's a moment that's really scary for people because it's
Mm,
like this identity might not be serving me so well or these habits, but like this is all I know. This is what I've
mm.
been doing my whole life. So to break that down, you go into this kind of like amorphous state, where you have to like create new patterns. You don't really have, you kind of lose your bearings.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, there were so many people I knew in the peak of the pandemic who actually were like, I don't know how to function stuck in my house during the lockdowns. And I remember me and various other disabled people that I knew were like, it's okay. We know how to do this here. This is how we survive in situations where, we're sick and can't leave the house or are housebound, or this is how we give our lives meaning. These are the things that stops us from having massive depressive stuff. And people, the responses I got off some of the posts and things that I wrote and, pieces that I sent to people were so positive, and it was really interesting to me how much people were like, "Oh God, there are actually people who know how to deal with this."
Mm,
And then the minute, you know, um, they sort of normality raised its head, they threw all that out the window, despite, and that's not me being bitter. I just find it very, very curious that they kind of went, "Oh, this knowledge is so useful now, but we'd rather chuck it out the window because, it means that we don't have to look at ourselves. We don't have to consider, I mean, one of the points people were making were like, how do you not get depressed by sitting on the internet and looking at the news all the time?" And one of the things that was said is the easiest way to do that is, if you don't want to just not look at the news, you know, pick a regular time where you check the news and then
mm,
don't do it for the rest of the day.
mhm,
And a lot of these structures that we develop, a lot of the rituals that sick and disabled people develop in order to, um, you know, build life and enhance their vitality, um, it's useful for everyone.
mhm,
But the fact of the matter is, a lot of people don't realize it until they're forced into it.
mm,
And what's always difficult from a both a storytelling, a magical, well, not both, but from a storytelling, magical and experiential level, is people don't understand these things really when you talk about them. They only kind of understand them when they directly experience them for
mhm,
themselves. And what's fascinating to me about that is that, you know, magic and ritual can actually induce these experiences, when you place them in the proper context. But we've kind of forgotten, you know, that the majority in the West have forgotten that in that sense the purpose of, ritualized spirituality is whatever you want to call spirituality. And I realize that's a nebulous term, but the whole point of that is actually not to give you peak experiences, but to give you entryways into that. Like, it's fascinating to me that anytime people who don't have a long-term grounding in these sort of experiences, whatever they are, will be like, "Oh, so you're just chasing peak experiences. You're just doing these rituals to have these highs." And it's like, some people are, but a good chunk of them are actually, you know, using them and working with them to literally change their internal and external worlds. But the notion that ritual, that there are certain patterns which can enhance your life, And I mean that in the sense of not some nebulous life force, but I mean allow you to find the richness in whatever life you have, um, it doesn't compute to a lot of people because they're like, why? It's you're saying it's that easy. I'm saying, structuring things like that is very easy to do, but or rather, it's very simple. It's not easy, shall we say? Um, and people look at that simplicity and go, why does, say, meeting in a very particular way once a week for 5 years have a massive psychological effect? It shouldn't do that. Like just meeting with people in a context of whether it's a meditative group or a discussion group or something in a regular, rhythm, for want of a better word, it changes the whole ground of your experience.
Hmm.
But explaining that to people and going, hi, it doesn't have to be the agenda. There has to be the periodicity and the rhythmicness to it. And people go, oh, well, that's horribly woo-woo. And it's just like, it's not. It's how our systems as human beings have always worked. But it winds me up because I think people don't understand, people think it's attached to religion. And I'm like, think about everybody has these little rituals.
Hmm.
And all you need to do is look at your own personal rituals and go, which of these personal rituals enhance life? And almost extrapolate outwards, you know, to that point where as you were saying earlier, yeah, you might get the urge to start a podcast, but that urge to start a podcast was born out of all the little rituals that you performed that actually kept that little flickering bit of curiosity going, whatever those were for you. And if you follow those, I don't know, the words that come to mind for me are rhythms again. Uh, if you follow those rhythms, it becomes a lot easier to be like, oh, actually, you know, I'm doing the things that I need to do, even if they don't seem connected. They really are on some deeper contextual level. Um, and I'm very much of the opinion that our relationship to time and space is ritualized. Like we were talking about before we started about how, you know, the past 5 years, it still feels like 2020. You
Mm.
know, time and space are different now. And that is because different things have been done and have occurred in those spaces. And, we can joke all we like about, um, time being subjective and but the very real act is that not everybody exists in the same time.
Mm.
That we don't, despite the railway timetable of colonialism or the 48-hour week, not everybody has the same 24 hours in the day. And I don't mean that in a, oh yeah, disabled people, it takes them longer or blah, blah, blah. I mean, if we accept that everybody lives in a different set of time and space, and it's maybe not universal, maybe it's localized as well in relationship to your landscape or whatever as well.
Hmm.
The moment you realize I don't have the same 24 hours in the day as everyone else, what do I have in those 24 hours? That's when it gets interesting to me because suddenly you're living a life that is in accord with where you are in the world. And I don't just mean locationally, I mean where you are in terms of your life, your location, everything is always about, for me, noticing exactly where you are because we spend so much of our time not thinking about where we are. We're thinking about where we're going next. It's always like, oh, what am I doing tomorrow? Um, and not what am I actually doing right now? And what did I do 30 seconds ago? And it's not so much embracing the power of now or whatever, but it is actually saying, actually, what is going on now that I'm not noticing? Because there's so much richness that is going on, even if you're going to the shops, for goodness sake. There's a whole level of information and worlds that are going on when you're just walking down, you drive to your mailbox or whatever. Like, there's just so much that we screen out.
Hmm.
Um, and there are so many openings, so many cracks for us to take opportunities, take stock of what's going on and see the pathways that are there. But we don't stop. We don't slow down again, to borrow from Bioacum Lafay's, the times are urgent. Let us slow down. Um, we don't even consider that because our entire society has gone, okay, we need to go faster. We need to fix this faster. And I think for me, that ties in with grief and going, what if there are things that can't be fixed? What do you do then?
Hmm.
What if there are ways you can't be healthy? What do you do then? What does health mean when you are chronically ill or sick? It doesn't mean the same thing, but you can be healthy while you're chronically sick. But that healthiness is takes into account your illness and then goes, okay, this is how I live well, even though I'm sick or disabled or in grief. And it just fascinates me that we have that. It's written down for us. It's recorded in all these magical texts, all these spiritual traditions worldwide. It's there in black and white and story, and we don't bother to check it, or the majority doesn't bother to check it. Um, so yeah.
Yeah, or people take like kind of the dogmatic parts of like religious or spiritual texts and they become like almost meaningless, just like these little phrases and stuff. And then people just kind of adhere to that without really thinking about what is being said or taught or what the meaning
Mm,
is or how that's applied in your life.
mm, mm. And also not just your life, how it was applied in the life of the people you were connected to who are long gone as well. And I'm not suggesting we, valorize the past or saying, we should get back to some sort of weird, traditional thing, but actually sitting there and going, okay, as an example, a lot of my family, a couple of 100 years ago were agricultural laborers. And one of the things about that, I was talking with an Irish friend of mine, and he's investigating Ireland's relationships to the transatlantic cables and America. And he said that in a lot of the records of the transatlantic cables, there is a thing where when they were finally connected, there would be spontaneous parties. And a lot of these agricultural laborers would come in and would have this huge party, and there'd be a bit of a carnival going on because at that time in Ireland, a lot of people had lost contact with their families when they'd
Hmm.
emigrated. So there was this whole thing of these transatlantic cables actually being kind of felt as a good thing for them. And the question was raised, well, how do agricultural laborers, you know, how did they get the time off work? And the point was raised. What you have to understand is that prior to 19th century, you got your work done, and that was it. The rest of your day was free.
Mhm.
You're not stuck in an office, or a factory for 8 hours. If you can get your work done in 4 to 6 hours, even though it's hard work, you know, it's a different time. You can do what you like, once you've, discharged your responsibilities. And to think that, you know, this has to really get it into ourselves that this is not the way it has always been is, I think, a deeply magical act because you're actually also saying, because it has not always been thus, it can actually be different.
Mhm.
And one of the biggest, blocks, I think, to people who are even considering, magic or even changing the world are like, oh, it's going to take so much effort because this is so entrenched. The reality that I'm in is so entrenched that I want to change it, but it's going to take so much effort to change it. And once you start sitting there thinking, actually, it wasn't always like this.
Mhm.
A lot of effort is being invested by the forces and the constructions to maintain, whatever version of reality you're experiencing. A lot of energy is being spent to make that the status quo, right?
Mhm.
And it has cracks. It has points where it doesn't quite work. And once you start understanding that those cracks exist and there can be doorways to recognizing it wasn't always like this and it won't always be like this, it becomes a lot easier to be like, oh, in that case, putting ourselves in positions where we're moving with change is a lot easier. It takes a lot less effort, because all you have to do is make small changes. You don't have to burn down the entire world in a, revolution. You can actually change it on a small, personal level,
Mhm.
and things ripple outwards.
Exactly. That's so true. This is a great way to start off the year. So I'm so glad we're talking. No, but it's
Mm,
so, so true. Like I just recently, like I guess a week and a half ago, took all the social media apps off my phone. And it's more like what you were talking about when you said like check the news, at a certain time each day. And then that's it. That's like what I'm doing. It's like I don't have the apps on my phone, so I just checked. I didn't close my accounts, but I just check it like when I sit down for work, like for my work
mm,
day, which is actually in the afternoon because I work from like 1 p.m. to 7 p.m. generally.
mm.
So it's like then I sit down and then I check and I post and whatever and I see what everyone's doing. But it's so nice just to have like the mornings free and I can already see like my concentration getting better and I'm reading more and it's just like, oh, it's like, oh, I remember what this is like when I wasn't like constantly being like, oh, what's happening or who's doing this or I have to post this or whatever. It's just like it's become so like all encompassing. So even just
Yeah.
making that little break has been really nice.
And
But it's exactly what you say, like just make small changes in your day-to-day life and it has a ripple effect in your own life and for your immediate surroundings and it continues to go outwards.
yeah, and I think one of the interesting things about that is even if you know, let's pick the social, since you brought that up, but the social media thing, people will be like, oh, I've got to limit. A lot of people be like, oh, I've got to limit myself because it's bad, and so on and so forth. And I'm like, yeah, but once you literally fix it as a kind of ritual, then actually that can sometimes turn something where you're like, I don't want to encounter this toxic thing, but I have to do it. But if you do it in a ritual context, whatever your understanding of ritual is, suddenly encountering that toxin becomes part of a larger context. So it's a bit like, I don't know, when you're literally sitting there going, rather than going, oh, I don't want to, do this or feel this because it's unpleasant. You're actually going, no, feeling it is part of a bigger ritual or a bigger pattern. And if once you put it in that bigger pattern or bigger context, that thing which might drain your life in the previous context can actually enliven you. It can actually, you know, so many people over the pandemic were like, oh, Zoom drains me, being on Zoom drains me. I can't do it. It's sapping my life. And for a whole bunch of people that I knew, they had that experience. And then then you were like, oh, yeah, but then we had regular intentional meetings on Zoom, right? That wasn't forced, that they weren't forced to do by their day jobs. They literally had a regular weekly intentional meeting of hanging out. And suddenly Zoom didn't, those meetings in the majority of them actually became enlivening. And so suddenly doing things on Zoom for them shifted because it wasn't always a drain. Because in some sense, it was, I think it was Wednesday night meetings. The Wednesday night meetings were enlivening, and suddenly that changes the whole context of Zoom, where even in their work day, where Zoom was absolutely tiring them out, they could see even in the tiring bits little peaks of energy that they could get, right? And I think this is the key with a lot of these things is that even the things we like to avoid contain little bits of life, you know, and sensitizing ourselves to those little bits of life, even in or big bits of life that are seemingly hidden. I mean, grief is another one, you know. We could say or like that grief, exists because of love or because of care or because of feeling. If you can look at grief as an expression of that love and feeling, then again, it shifts it. But it's something more than just sitting there and going, okay, I'm going to reframe this experience. Because like just saying, oh, I'm reframing is still this kind of weird voluntarism to it. And I think one of the interesting things about doing in a ritual context, at least the way I'm working within the context of the stuff that I call Cripkult, is that a lot of the ritual, once you start setting it up, runs itself. So it becomes this thing which isn't actually a voluntary, you know, act of will, shall we say. I'm more and more sorry, Alistair. I am a little bit dubious of the idea of will in the context that most occultists might refer to it. Now, there are some who would say actually, Crowley and true will isn't the same. That's fair enough, but I'm very dubious about this notion of magic and stuff as solely a willful exertion. You know that there is also this um, involuntary set of setups, which in a perhaps more animist culture, you'd be like, oh, okay. I mean, even in astrological culture, where you're like, you can't beat the stars, but you can ameliorate. And that's what the astrology is for. It's about finding which ways you can ameliorate the planets that have been messing with you since the day you were born. You can't beat them, but you can work out relationships that enhance your life. And that means that again, we're not the prime mover and shakers. And that's okay because you don't actually have to be the prime mover and shaker to enhance your life and the world around you. To be fully present and participating in the networks of relations in which you're involved is somehow often more generative than the classic, I am all powerful and you will do what I say. Because, you've got backup when you're acting relationally with a whole bunch of people. You're not out there on a limb, you know, risking everything on one, one vision of the world. Um, and I think one of the tricks for anybody who's playing with magic is that ability to work with multiple worlds that operate all at once and not necessarily be like, I am enforcing my will, but going, I am creating conditions for a particular set of realities to come into existence um, in my life and the life of others or in the context that I want them to. And it to me, it always comes down to this notion of how can we live in a way which, no matter what happens, we're not invincible. Rather, how can we take the knocks and not be totally destroyed every single time? How can we literally roll with the punches and then in rolling with the punches turn it into a dance? I have a friend who's really into capoeira, and the martial arts sort of dance fusion that is um, for its as I understand it, its way of it's just a dance while also training yourself in physical combat was something that comes out of Brazilian enslaved folks going, we need to defend ourselves, but we also need to do it in such a way that we don't get noticed by the authorities. So it's
Mm.
just a dance. And the two things have kind of created this wonderful, fusion. And like the distinction between dancing and fighting and all these things, how do you dance with the situations rather than necessarily fighting, you know? And the idea that dancing, you can also fight via dancing if that's your thing. You don't have to switch into those necessarily easily that, you know, definable and recuperatable. Oh, yes, you know, this is fighting mode and this is dancing mode. Um, and I guess that comes for me from learning to conceive of multiple contexts at once, multiple worlds at once, that are ongoing. Um,
I love it.
and
I don't know if you've listened to the episode. It was actually the first episode of 2024 with my friend Cadmus Herschel. But he talks about, yeah, like the multiplicity of like pagan thoughts and like pre-monotheistic thinking and like the universe is like constantly being created. So there's no like beginning or end. There's like multiple beginnings and endings, and they're all kind of
mm,
overlapping and thinking of it like as a braid or like a rope being braided or something.
yeah, yeah, I mean, I would definitely, I mean, one of my, as well as the braid, it's also for me, it's also um, the ripple of pebbles in a pond and the interference patterns or the weave, literally the weave of fate. There's a whole tradition in Greek, Roman, and Norse stuff of like it's not even the story of beating fate. It's the idea that you can't beat fate because fate is actually the weave, is actually the intersections of all these ripples and things, and they're bigger than us. And yeah, you have the tragic, heroic stories of people trying to go against fate or prophecy or things like that and getting absolutely screwed over. And it's not about submitting to your fate. It's about understanding the ripples and working out which way is the best path for you to do what you need to do. And the complicatedness of that requires a notion that, well, I think it requires a kind of double-mindedness in the sense of, or maybe third-mindedness in that sense, where you are literally sitting here going, I don't know what's going on, but I can see that there are these different contexts. But I also trust that in some way there's some relation that I can't see, and not in the sense of blind faith, but going, okay, if everything is connected and woven, then every thread, everything on the thread is connected to another thread. So
Mm.
what I directly have to do is kind of loosen my grip on a particular thread and kind of just trace where another bit might, you know, touch it. And that might give me an out or a deepening, because it's not always about escape. Sometimes it's about deepening, you know, um, from the situations that I'm in. And one of the big um, situational things about the pandemic for me during its peak, during the lockdowns, was people suddenly realizing, oh, I don't actually like my living space, but I'm not here enough to ever have had that, or I'm busy doing other things. So, I've never really considered that. Actually, I don't like the way my furniture's arranged, or I don't like my wallpaper or whatever. And that to me is symptomatic of the larger problem of people don't sit and they look at their lives and go, actually, I kind of don't like my life, or I like this bit, but I don't like that bit. And how those bits all interlink, like you say, it's not just a psychoanalytical thing; it's genuinely a biophysical thing as well. Of going, hmm, you know, the pandemic was like when everybody suddenly clicked that it was actually mostly airborne, and people go, "Oh, how do we deal with this? Because it's airborne." And people going, "You realize we could help with this by improving the air quality in the spaces in which we live. We could change it by changing our architecture, literally changing the atmosphere of our workspaces, and that would help us." And what I found really interesting about that was the pushback, because it was this weird thing where so many people were kind of almost unconsciously saying, we don't want to think about that because it's too close to the old idea of miasma. And I'm like, yeah, but miasma wasn't necessarily just bad air. Miasma was also, bad atmosphere, which is not the
Mm.
same thing. But if we think about things like that, and we don't necessarily dismiss these other ways of thinking and going, okay, so these people believed in this thing. Let's not be a ha ha ha, they were all superstitious. Let's try and work out what he did in that world. What did the ancient Greek idea of miasma actually mean, and what did it do in the context of that society? Well, it was talking about, okay, you know, this is a bad place. You don't want to hang out here. You don't want to hang out here. This place needs cleansing. It needs dealing with. You know, if there'd been a battle, you know, there's a whole bunch of shades around. Of course, you need to either avoid the shades of the dead, because there's a whole bunch of psychological and spiritual stuff going on. Or, if you do it, you have to cleanse the area, and it's not about wiping everything away. It's about working out, okay, this place is not so good. So what do we do? And the fact that there's still pushback, even on a quote scientific level, about this really kind of emphasizes to me how much our modern society really doesn't want to contemplate the fact that there are other agencies in our world. We don't want to think about there are other agencies in our houses, in our bathrooms. You know, we know, most of us who've been educated in the West, we know about germs, but we don't
Mm,
actually think of them as, oh, they're not smart. They're just blobs of stuff. I'm like, if you think about them as, they don't have human intelligence, but they want to grow, they want to replicate, they have an agenda. They're everywhere, and
mm,
and this is not just, you know, there's a whole thing I was reading the other day about the fact that the Amazon rainforest um, is nourished by I think it's diatoms, and diatoms are the corpses of multicellular life that used to live at the bottom of the ocean.
mm,
And the Amazon is nourished by winds that lifts it up, I think, from the Sahara. And the corpses of these things from when the Sahara was an ocean.
mm,
And the wind lifts up these corpses of these microorganisms, carries it across and dumps it in the soil of the Amazon, which is why partially the Amazon is so fertile.
mm,
And I'm sitting here going, billions of years of microbial life at the bottom of an ocean is feeding that are dead. The corpses of billions of them are feeding the lungs of the planet, in which we're all breathing. Every bit of that air that we are now breathing is partially thanks to a whole bunch of, you know, small celled organisms that are long dead in a dried up sea that is apparently now one of the most inhospitable places in the earth, but wasn't always.
mm.
And what does that sort of shift in mindset do? Well, to me, it's completely should shift your ontology, a whole lot to this idea that, okay, every aspect of our life isn't entirely ours.
Well, that's beautiful. Can you believe that we've been talking for a whole hour?
I mean, I think
That went
I've
by in
ever,
like 2 seconds.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Now I want you on every year, okay?
Okay, yeah, we can do that. We can do that.
I
Yeah.
love talking to you.
I mean, I feel like I do most of the talking, and I feel kind of
Okay, I
guilty,
love
but yeah,
listening to you.
that's fair. That's fair. But no, I'd be happy to do that. Yeah, yeah.
Good, because yeah, I feel like we have so much more to talk about just with the what you were talking about with like the ritual times of like meeting with others. I think about psychoanalysis and therapy sessions is that too. Like people are like, oh, what do you talk about? It's like it's the act of doing it. Just start doing it, like meeting
Yeah.
once a week or twice a week. And just that in itself creates this kind of rhythm, like you were saying, that starts to change things, you know? And then,
Mm,
of course you talk through it and you see what you have to say during that, but like just get it started. And also what you were saying about people with like the idea, like the magical idea of things being so causal, like I will this to happen, I want this to happen. Like that's not the right way to think about magic. I totally agree. It's
mm,
also that's also so like egocentric or like identity centric, like what your conscious mind is like articulating, but like what about your whole unconscious mind? What about everything else
yeah.
you're connected to? And like really I see magic as like this unfolding, like psychoanalysis of like kind of allowing yourself to like use more of yourself and like also like you said like get more in tune with what's around you and like start working with things rather than being like I want this much money I want a
Mm,
car like
mm.
that's not my magic.
And I think that there's nothing wrong with being like, I want this, I want this, I want the car. And I'm not knocking people who do magic for that. I'm just saying I think it's easier when you sit there and go, my urge to get a car, what is that, based upon? And do I actually want a car? Or do I actually want, a status symbol? Or do I actually want, a reliable form of transport? Those are not necessarily, the best ways to get those differing desires may not be car, may not be, and the way you work out what works best for you in life is kind of not assuming that it's always a car. or that, it'll be, I want an extra 50 grand in my job for a pay rise. It might be, that might be what you need. But the assumption that it's always a particular thing that you need doesn't kind of work unless you situate it within the wider context, which is what I think divination's for and was for, is trying to trace those relations and go, actually, what is the right thing to do here? What is the right thing to ask for? This is my situation. But yeah, yeah, I think it is a lot easier to do it the indirect way than it is to do the direct way, for me anyway.
Totally. And it's kind of like the CBT of magic. And CBT, cognitive behavior therapy, can work. Like it does help to reframe your thinking about things at certain points. You can do both. You can have like the
Hmm.
practical reframing or like, I want this. And then you can also have like the bigger picture, deeper psychoanalytic talk therapy understanding. Work on
Yeah,
different levels.
yeah.
And the other thing I just want to mention before we close, and of course, if there's anything you're working on that you want to mention or anything you have coming up, of course, but I also want to talk about centering disability in activism. I feel like it's so important,
Hmm.
and you see it going around in memes and stuff online, but it's like really true. And can we do this more?
Hmm. Well, I mean, this is one of the interesting things because I think it is disability needs to be well, it doesn't need to be. It will be the forefront of everybody's life at some point. And it's often better to kind of think about that before, or try and think about it before it hits you, whether that be purely I have become old or, some sort of, health problem has happened. But what's interesting as well is the way you said it needs to be done for activism, and I think it does, but I also think there is this tendency to see activism as literally the best way to do it. And what I'm deeply interested in is interrogating the ableist assumptions of activism,
Mm.
wherein, people are saying, oh, you've got to be an activist, you've got to go out and you've got to do this. And I'm saying, that's great and that works, but there's whole other layers to this stuff. And a lot of what I and some of my friends are working on is this idea of what happens, you know, in excess of activism, what happens outside of activism, post activism, all the definitions of activism that we use. Um, in what way can you even crypt that? In what way can you say, and I'm not the only one doing this, there's plenty of other people all over the world doing this, but there is this, you know, phenomenon where people think about, oh, we're gonna post these memes on the internet and that's praxis, or praxis involves going out on a protest. And what's interesting about that, and it ties into what I said about um, the whole notion of the status quo, is the status quo is quite skilled at recuperating
Mm.
activism. Right. It's really, really, we saw it with Black Lives Matter. We saw it with, the protests in 2020. Uh, you know, we we saw it with Occupy. We saw it with, the anti-Iraq war movement. Status quo is really good at going, oh, look, there's millions of people in the streets. And it doesn't necessarily have to squish it with, shock troops. It can just sit there and go, yeah, fair enough. You've got millions of people protesting. And then 10 years down the line, what's actually changed? So, what I'm also interested in is what are the ways in which we can um, do something that isn't automatically recuperated within the framework of that. So, there's a lot of interesting work being obviously done by black scholars, but I'm really into reading a lot of Fred Moten and Stefano Harney's stuff at the moment about the undercommons and things like that. But I don't have any actual major projects slated for 2025 yet. We're early in the year, so who knows? Stuff might happen, but um, I do think disability is important because, quite frankly, as I said on social media multiple times, we live in a eugenic society, a society which is based upon the idea of trying to adapt the human form to its most able, whatever that means, and rejecting and getting rid of those it regards as less able or disabled. And that is a structure that framework has existed since at least the 19th century, and we saw it in the pandemic. We've seen it in the attitudes towards disabled people during the peak pandemic, and even now, people who have very genuine, justified reasons for masking are being told, no, masking is either a shibboleth or it's an illegal thing. All the laws that were being put in about mask bans in the US because it was some sort of cover for terrorism completely abandons the people who are immunosuppressed and need to wear masks and even did before the pandemic. They're
Hmm.
just, they're thrown out. So there is this very real notion for me that, amongst other things, disability is the thing that our society really doesn't want to look at. And the pandemic has really brought that home, I think, to a lot of people, to be honest, because
Hmm.
a lot of more people are becoming disabled because of the side effects of COVID. You
Hmm.
know, long COVID is skyrocketing. People are actually going, oh crap, post-viral fatigue is a thing. And
Hmm.
unfortunately for the folks who already had post-viral fatigue, they're going, yes, we told you. It's really good that you acknowledge this now. Could have done with that acknowledgement 20 years ago. But and it's obviously going to get worse. The fires in LA. A whole bunch of people will have health problems from that because they've
Hmm.
inhaled, stuff from burning buildings.
Hmm.
You know, Disablement is something that is going to become even more prevalent for most of our species as the climate changes. And so, yeah, we do need to look at what that means, how to exist as a species, as a society, under conditions which will disable us, you know, either now or in 10, 15 years, or whenever one of those other agencies says, hey, guys, your life is going to be different now. Um, and that I think is key.
Well, thank you so much, Craig. We're going to check in at the end of the year and see what's happened.
Cool. Cool. Yeah.
That's the plan now.
All right.
And of course, you're writing on Cripkult in the Fenris Wolf 10, which I'll link to. And you're writing Creeping Mortality in Rendering Unconscious, the new one, volume one,
Hmm.
out of the two-volume set, which I'll send you. Just send me your address.
Yep.
And where do people find you?
You can find me at my website at cold-albion.net. Or you can find me on Blue Sky. Just use the search function to find me, or you can find me there at mrvi.coldalbion.net. I'm also on Mastodon a little bit, but yeah, that's mostly my social media these days. So there we go.
Wonderful. And we'll link to everything in the show notes. Thank
All
you so
right.
much,
Thank
Craig. It
you.
was so
Thank
good
you.
to talk with you. Bye.
Bye.